He spent his last 2 silvers to save the giant widow from the auction block. And before the crowd could even draw breath to laugh, she did the one thing no one ever expected. She claimed him, right there, on the block, in front of God and everyone. That single act, in the dusty Wyoming territory of 1883, wasn't just mercy. It was a lit match dropped on a trail of gunpowder that would burn the whole frontier to the ground. The auctioneer's gavel was still vibrating on the podium when she turned. Her eyes weren't pleading. They weren't soft. They were predator's eyes, locking onto him like he was the last piece of meat for 100 miles. The whole town square went dead silent. You could hear a man's heart beating from 50 yards away. Dust motes hung in the air, frozen. The whole world was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. "I claim this man," she said. Her voice wasn't a shout. It was a statement of fact, like she was reading from a book that had already been written. The sheriff, a barrel of a man named Croft, let out a harsh laugh that sounded like rocks grinding together. "That law ain't been used in 30 years, Rowan. You can't be serious." But beside him, the county clerk, a little man drowning in his own coat, was squinting at a dusty, torn page in a massive ledger. His finger traced a line of faded ink. He swallowed hard. "Frontier Code 211, he whispered, his voice trembling. It still stands, Sheriff. The widow's choice. It's still the law." The sheriff's face went from amused to furious in a heartbeat. His hand drifted toward the Colt on his hip, but it was too late. The law was the law. The crowd wasn't looking at the giant woman on the block anymore. They were all looking at him, at Cal Whitaker. Cal just stood there. His coat was frayed at the cuffs, his boots had more holes than leather, and he was staring up at a woman who towered over every man in that square. Her hands were still bound in rusted iron chains. A line of dried blood snaked down her wrist from where the cuffs had bit into her skin. But she didn't flinch. She didn't even look down. She just stared at Cal. And in her eyes, he saw a terrifying certainty. It was like she knew his past, his future, every secret he'd ever kept. "Why?" Cal mouthed the word, not even sure if sound came out. She didn't answer him. A corner of her mouth twitched, the ghost of a smile that never quite formed. It was more terrifying than any snarl. Sheriff Croft scowled, his face turning a deep, angry red. "He's got no land, Rowan. No horse. He ain't got a name worth the dirt on his boots. You want to chain yourself to that piece of driftwood?" Rowan Hale finally broke her gaze from Cal and turned to the sheriff. Her voice was cold enough to frost the air. "He was the only one in this whole town who looked at me and saw a person, not property." And just like that, the spell was broken. The crowd erupted, not in cheers, but in a low, ugly roar of disbelief and ridicule. Rowan Hale, the widow of Winder's Ridge, 6'5" of raw muscle and quiet fury, a woman strong enough to break a man in half, now shackled by law to a penniless carpenter whose last 2 coins weren't even his own. They'd been borrowed from the pocket of a dead man's coat he'd found on the trail. "You bought yourself a bride, Cal?" A voice sneered from the crowd. "Or did she buy you?" Cal didn't answer. He couldn't. He was still locked in the gravity of her stare. He had acted on instinct, on a flicker of decency he thought had died in him years ago. He'd seen them parade her up there like an animal, and he'd done the only thing he could. He had no idea it would lead to this. The clerk, eager to be done with it, tore the auction notice in half. 1 piece for the canceled sale, 1 for the impromptu marriage record. "Buy the book," the clerk muttered, not looking anyone in the eye. "She can't be auctioned. She's a married woman." "Take her chains off," Cal said. His own voice surprised him. It was steady. It was firm. The sheriff didn't move. He just stood there, a smirk playing on his lips, enjoying the spectacle. Cal took a step forward, then another. He walked right up to the platform, ignoring the whispers and the glares. He stood at the base of the auction block and looked up at the sheriff. "I said, Take them off. Rowan's eyes narrowed. The crowd grew quiet again, sensing the shift in the air. This wasn't a joke anymore. This was a challenge. With a disgusted sigh, the sheriff finally pulled a key from his belt. He didn't unlock the cuffs gently. He jammed the key in and twisted, yanking the iron shackles off her wrists. They hit the dusty platform with a heavy, final thud. Rowan didn't rub her wrists. She didn't even glance at the raw, bleeding skin. She just stepped down from the block, moving with a strange grace for a woman her size. She walked past the sheriff, past the sneering landowner, Virgil Brack, who had orchestrated the whole thing, past all the townsfolk who had come to watch her humiliation. She walked right up to Cal, so close he had to crane his neck to look up at her. "You ready to walk?" she asked, her voice low. He blinked, confused. "What?" "Out of this town," she said, her eyes flicking toward the open road. "Before they find a new law to hang us with." He didn't have to think about it. He just nodded. Side by side, the giant and the drifter walked out of the town square. They didn't run. They walked with a purpose that silenced the crowd. The town of Bright Marrow buzzed behind them like a hornet's nest that had just been kicked, but nobody made a move to stop them. Not yet, anyway. The real trouble was just getting started. The dirt road leading out of Bright Marrow was a lonely stretch of nothing. The smells of pine and manure from the town faded, replaced by the dry, clean scent of sagebrush and hot rock. They walked for what felt like an hour before either of them spoke. "You just married a complete stranger," Cal said, his voice raspy. "So did you," she replied, not looking at him. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon. "You could have picked a richer woman." "You could have picked a man whose boots didn't have holes in them," he shot back. "You had silver. That's all that mattered." "That was my last 2 coins," he admitted, the words tasting like ash. She stopped dead in the middle of the road. She turned to face him, and for the first time, he saw something other than iron in her eyes. It was confusion, disbelief. "You spent your very last dollar to save me?" Cal looked up at her, the height difference between them feeling like a canyon. His jaw was tight. "What they were doing to you back there, it wasn't right." She stared at him, her face unreadable. The silence stretched on, broken only by the wind whistling through the dry grass. Finally, she gave a single, sharp nod. "That's enough of a reason," she said, and started walking again. They reached the edge of town, a place marked by a single, splintered fence post, and sat down in the dirt. They were breathless, not from the walk, but from the sheer, crushing weight of what they had just done. They were legally bound, 2 strangers tied together by an archaic law and a desperate act. "Why were they selling you?" Cal asked, breaking the silence. Rowan stared out at the jagged hills, her profile as harsh and beautiful as the landscape. "My husband's land. A man named Brack wants it. After my husband died, the sheriff declared the land forfeit, said I had no claim." Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. But then she added a chilling detail. "They claimed I killed him." Cal's blood went cold. "Did you?" She finally turned to look at him. Her eyes were clear and steady, without a hint of deception. "I didn't put the knife in his gut," she said slowly, "but I didn't stop the man who did." A whole new world of questions opened up in Cal's mind, but he didn't ask them. Not yet. "This Brack," he said instead. "Why does he want your land so bad?" "The ridge," she said, a flicker of something, pride maybe or pain in her voice. "There's water up there, a deep spring that never runs dry. In this territory, water isn't just life, it's power. So they just declared you property to get it. They called it restitution for my husband's debts." She spat the word like poison. "Said they needed a public sale to keep things orderly." She kicked at a loose stone. "They wanted to make an example of me. to show everyone what happens when you stand up to Virgil Brack. Cal rubbed his tired face. The whole situation was spiraling out of his control. So, what happens now? I don't know, she said honestly. We're married. By law, what's mine is yours. I noticed, he said dryly. The wind picked up, carrying the distant scream of a hawk. A sense of desolation settled over him. I have nowhere to go, he admitted, the words feeling like a betrayal. That money I spent, it wasn't even mine. I was supposed to be on a horse riding out of this territory tonight, to never look back. Rowan's voice dropped, becoming a low, dangerous rumble. Then maybe, she said, looking him dead in the eye, you married exactly the right woman. Because she wasn't just a widow. She was a fighter, and she had just found her first ally in a war she'd been losing. They found shelter in an abandoned livery stable on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, just 4 crumbling walls and a roof that looked like a strong wind could carry it away. They lay back to back on a single, threadbare horse blanket, the night cold biting through their thin clothes. Neither of them slept. The old wood of the stable creaked and groaned around them. Rats scurried in the darkness. Rowan kept a heavy blacksmith's hammer she'd found near her hand. Cal had nothing but the calluses on his palms and a gut full of a regret so deep it felt like a sickness. He wasn't a hero. He was a man running from his own ghosts, and he'd just run headfirst into someone else's war. Just before the first hint of dawn, a rock clattered against the stable door. Then another. Cal and Rowan were on their feet in an instant, their eyes meeting in the dim light. Before they could even speak, the stable door didn't just open. It exploded inward, ripped from its hinges by a single, powerful kick. 4 figures filled the doorway, silhouetted against the pale, pre-dawn sky. They were Brack's men. There she is, one of them growled, his voice thick with menace. Brack wants her back. Says the contract's void. She was never free to marry. She's claimed, Cal yelled, surprising himself with the force in his voice. He stood his ground, spreading his arms protectively in front of Rowan, even though she was a head taller than him. She's property, another man snarled, stepping forward into the stable. Brack's property. She's my wife, Cal said, the words feeling strange and powerful on his tongue. The closest man didn't bother with more words. He just lunged. Cal wasn't a big man. He wasn't particularly strong or fast, but in that moment he didn't move an inch. He was a rock, a wall. The punch was a blur of motion. It connected with Cal's jaw with a sickening crack. Pain exploded behind his eyes, and he dropped to one knee, the metallic taste of blood filling his mouth. But he had bought her a second, and a second was all Rowan needed. She moved like a thunderstorm. Before the man who hit Cal could even pull his fist back, she was on him. She grabbed the front of his shirt and slammed his head into a thick wooden support beam. The sound of his skull hitting the wood echoed through the stable like a gunshot. He crumpled to the ground without a sound. She spun, her elbow catching the second man square in the throat. He gasped, clutching at his neck, his eyes wide with shock and pain. The third man was smarter. He pulled a long, wicked-looking knife from his belt. Rowan! Cal yelled, trying to get to his feet. But she was already in motion. She moved with a speed that defied her size, grabbing an old broom handle from the wall. With a sharp crack, she brought it down across the man's wrist. He screamed as the bone snapped, and the knife clattered to the floor. Before he could recover, she drove her knee hard into his gut, doubling him over. The fourth man, seeing his friends taken down in a matter of seconds, backed away slowly, his hands held up in surrender. Look, she ain't even got the land anymore, he stammered, his eyes wide with fear. It's forfeit. You're fighting for a ghost. Rowan stood over the man with the broken wrist, the splintered broom handle held like a weapon. She turned her cold, furious gaze on the last man standing. You go tell Virgil Brack, she said, her voice a low, steady promise of violence. If he wants a ghost, I'll be more than happy to come back and haunt him myself. The man didn't need to be told twice. He turned and fled into the gray morning light. Cal sat in the hay, dizzy and breathing hard, spitting a mouthful of blood onto the dusty floor. Rowan looked down at him, her chest heaving. The storm in her eyes was starting to recede, replaced by a weary calm. "You just married into a war carpenter," she said. He managed a weak, bloody grin. "Yeah," he said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "I think I was starting to figure that out." She reached down, her large, calloused hand surprisingly gentle, and pulled him to his feet like he weighed nothing at all. They stood there, face to face in the quiet aftermath of the fight. Still strangers, still without rings or promises. But they were bound now, not just by some forgotten law, but by spilled blood and the shared understanding that in this harsh, unforgiving land, they were all each other had. "You still want to ride out of this territory?" she asked, her voice softer now. Cal looked at her, at the strength and the fire and the deep, hidden pain in her eyes, and he knew his running days were over. "No," he said, his voice firm. "I want to know what's on that ridge that's worth dying for." Rowan looked past him, toward the hills that were just beginning to catch the first golden rays of sunrise. "Then let's go find out," she said. The sky was bleeding gold and purple behind the mountains. The war had just begun. They set off as the sun crested the ridge, a destination that felt a world away. Cal walked with a stiff gait, his jaw a canvas of purple and blue, every breath a sharp reminder of the punch he'd taken. Rowan moved with a long, steady stride, a canvas sack slung over her shoulder. It held the sum of their worldly possessions, a handful of dried beans, half a loaf of stale cornbread, and a single chipped enamel mug. They didn't have a horse, just their own 2 feet, and a desperate, unspoken hope. After an hour of walking in silence, the only sound their boots crunching on the dry, rocky ground, Cal couldn't take it anymore. "You always this quiet?" he asked. She glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Only when I'm trying to figure out how not to die." "Fair enough," he conceded. They continued on, the land growing harsher with every step. The scrub brush gave way to skeletal dead trees. The bleached bones of cattle, picked clean by coyotes and vultures, littered the landscape. Overhead, a pair of buzzards circled lazily, like they were patient undertakers just waiting for their next clients. This wasn't just land, it was a graveyard. "So that ridge," Cal said, breaking the silence again. "It's really yours?" Rowan nodded, her eyes never leaving the path ahead. "It was my husband's, which means it should be mine now. But Virgil Brack has been swallowing up land from widows for 3 winters straight. It's his favorite pastime. How does he get away with it?" "It's a simple formula," she said, her voice laced with a bitterness so sharp it could cut steel. "He pays off the judge. The sheriff discovers some debt or unpaid tax. They clear the deed, and then they auction off whatever's left of a person's life for pennies on the dollar." Cal spat in the dust. The story was sickeningly familiar. "I've seen it happen before. Back in a town called Clay River. A man tries to fight it. He ends up facing the wrong end of a rope." "And you?" she asked, a hint of curiosity in her voice. "Did you try to fight it?" "I tried to ask questions," he admitted. "Woke up in a ditch 2 days later with a lump on my head and no memory of how I got there." For the first time, something close to a smile touched Rowan's lips, though it was a grim, mirthless thing. "You ask questions like that around here," she said. "You'll wake up in a pine box." They climbed a narrow, winding trail that snaked its way up a broken cliff face. The higher they went, the thinner and cooler the air became. The world below them shrank, the town of Bright Marrow becoming a tiny, insignificant smudge in the distance. A blackbird shot across the sky in front of them, its cry a sharp, lonely sound. By late morning they reached a small plateau, a flat piece of land tucked between 2 gently sloping hills. In the center of it stood a shack. It was barely more than 4 walls and a roof made of rusted scrap tin, but it was a home. Smoke had blackened the stones of the chimney, a testament to fires lit on cold nights. A single tall cedar tree stood beside the shack like a silent guardian or a lonely gravestone. Rowan stopped, her shoulders slumping slightly. "This was it," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "This was mine." Cal looked around. The place had been ravaged. The fence was torn down in several places. The water troughs were bone dry and cracked. But there was a stubbornness to it, a feeling that this small piece of land had bled and fought to survive. It felt sacred. "We buried him over there," she said softly, pointing to a small raised mound of earth marked with a crude, splintered cross. "There was no service, no preacher, just me and the girl." The words hit Cal like a physical blow. He knelt beside the simple grave, tracing the rough wood of the cross with his fingers. "You have children?" he asked, his voice low. Rowan shook her head, a fresh wave of pain washing over her face. "My sister, Ilara, she's 11 years old, and she's got more fire and wit in her than any 10 men in Bright Marrow." "Where is she now?" Rowan's voice cracked, the iron control she held so tightly finally breaking. "I sent her away, to a family in Hideout Creek, a few days' ride from here. I sent her away when Brack's men started showing up, sniffing around the property. I knew what was coming." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "If she had seen them drag me away, if she had seen what they did." She couldn't finish the sentence. The words choked in her throat. "You want to get her back," Cal said. It wasn't a question. "I want to give her something worth coming back to," she replied, her voice regaining its strength. Cal stood up, brushing the dust from his knees. A new resolve settled in him. This wasn't just about a piece of land anymore. It wasn't just about defiance. It was about a little girl waiting in a town called Hideout Creek. "Then we fix this place," he said. "We don't have time," she argued. "Brack and the sheriff—" "We make time," he interrupted. "We hammer what we can. We set traps. We make this place a fortress." "You said there's water here." Rowan pointed up the ridge, about 30 yards north of the cabin. "The spring comes right out of the rock face. It's never run dry." "Then that's life," Cal said, his eyes meeting hers. "And life is always worth defending." She stared at him, a long, searching look. He saw a flicker of hope in her eyes, a dangerous, fragile thing that she had tried to extinguish long ago. Without another word, she handed him the canvas sack. They worked until the sun began to dip below the mountains, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and red. They worked with a frantic, desperate energy. Cal, the carpenter, used bent nails and a heavy rock to mend the broken fence line. Rowan, with her incredible strength, chopped a mountain of firewood, the rhythmic thud of her axe echoing through the silent hills. They patched the broken door with scrap wood. They sealed the one shattered window with mud and grass. They stacked stones around the small porch, creating a low, defensive wall. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't perfect, but when they were done, the little shack no longer looked abandoned. It looked alive. It looked defiant. That night, they sat by a small fire just outside the cabin door. They passed the single chipped mug back and forth, drinking a weak, bitter coffee that tasted more like smoke than beans. The silence between them was different now. It was comfortable, companionable. "You've always been this kind?" Rowan asked suddenly, staring into the flames. "No," Cal answered honestly. "What changed?" He didn't answer. He just looked out into the vast, star-filled darkness. He thought of his brother, shot down in the dust for asking the wrong questions. He thought of the years he'd spent drifting, running, letting that bitterness curdle inside him. He didn't have the words to explain it, and she didn't press him for them. Later, as the fire burned down to glowing embers, she watched him meticulously patching a tear in his frayed coat with a crooked needle and a piece of thread he'd pulled from the horse blanket. "You're a carpenter," she stated, not a question. "I was," he corrected her. "Back before my brother was murdered for asking who was stealing cattle out of the Purgatory Flats." She looked up from the fire, her eyes sharp and focused. "You're looking for revenge?" "No," he said, tying off the thread. "I'm looking for something to believe in again." The fire cracked, sending a shower of sparks into the night air. And then they heard it, the unmistakable sound of hoofbeats in the distance. Not one horse, several. Rowan was on her feet in an instant, the blacksmith's hammer appearing in her hand as if by magic. Her body was tense, her eyes narrowed, scanning the darkness down the slope. 3 riders emerged from the shadows, their forms illuminated by the bobbing light of a lantern one of them carried. They reined in their horses on the slope just below the cabin. Brack's men. "Evening, Miss Hale," one of them called out, his voice dripping with false, syrupy charm. "Heard you went and married yourself a ghost, a man with nothing to his name." "And yet, I'm a free woman," Rowan called back, her voice ringing out in the clear night air. "Not for long," another man sneered. "The sheriff says that marriage contract is invalid. Judge Trolley is going to overturn it by sunrise, and when he does, you're right back on the auction block." The man then pointed a gloved finger at Cal. "And he'll be an outlaw, wanted for marriage fraud." Cal stepped up beside Rowan, his hand resting on the handle of a rusty axe propped against the cabin wall. "You want to come up here and say that to my face?" The 3rd rider just laughed, a low, ugly sound. "Nah, we'll let the law handle you. Enjoy your last night of freedom. It's the last one you'll have together." With another laugh, they turned their horses and rode off, disappearing back into the darkness. Cal let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Now what?" he asked, his voice low. "We can't hold them all off." Rowan turned to him, her eyes gleaming in the firelight. A dangerous idea was forming behind them. "Then we don't wait for them to come to us," she whispered. "We go back to town?" Cal asked, incredulous. "That's suicide." "No," Rowan said, a fierce, determined look on her face. "We don't go to the sheriff. We don't go to the judge. We go to the land office." Cal's eyes widened. "They're all in Brack's pocket. They won't help us." "They might not have to," Cal said, a slow, secret smile spreading across his face. He reached into the lining of his old, torn coat, his fingers searching for a hidden pocket. He pulled out a small, oilskin-wrapped packet. Carefully, he unfolded it. It was a piece of old, yellowed parchment, a map. Rowan stared at it, her brow furrowed in confusion. "My father," Cal said, his voice filled with a reverence she hadn't heard before, "was a government surveyor. He mapped this entire territory for the federal government 20 years ago, before Brack ever set foot here." He pointed to a spot on the map, a spot that corresponded to the ridge they were standing on. "He found the spring, yes, but he also found a second one deeper in the mountain, a source so strong it could water this whole valley." He then pulled out a second document, a provisional land claim filed with the territorial seat. Rowan's breath caught in her throat. "You've been carrying this whole time?" "I was saving it," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "I was waiting for a reason to use it." She stepped closer, her gaze fixed on the papers in his hand. "You think this will hold up in court?" "It's a federal claim," he said. "It supersedes any local deed. But," he added, his expression turning serious, "it will only be recognized if we can prove we were lawfully married when I transferred the claim to our shared name." For the first time since he'd met her, Rowan Hale smiled. It was a slow, dangerous, and breathtakingly beautiful thing. It was the smile of a woman who had just been handed a sword. "Then we better go find ourselves a witness," she said. They packed what little they had at first light, a sense of grim purpose hanging in the air. But before they could start their journey back down the treacherous path to Bright Marrow, a lone rider appeared on the trail below. It was Sheriff Croft. He was alone, a dusty rifle resting across his saddle. He reined his horse to a stop a few yards from the cabin. Rowan immediately moved to stand between him and Cal, her hand once again finding the handle of her hammer. "This land is under official dispute," the sheriff said, his voice flat and official. He wasn't smiling today. "And we're on our way to settle that dispute," Cal replied, his hand hovering near the axe. The sheriff's eyes didn't blink. They were cold and hard as river stones. "Virgil Brack filed formal charges this morning. Claims you," he said, nodding at Rowan, "lured this drifter into a fraudulent marriage to gain protection for a forfeited property. I spent my last 2 coins to stop a woman from being sold like cattle." Cal snapped back, his anger flaring. "That's not fraud, Sheriff. In some places, they still call that decency." "You really think decency matters to a circuit court judge on Brack's payroll?" Croft asked, a hint of something that might have been pity in his voice. "No," Cal said, stepping forward so he stood shoulder to shoulder with Rowan. He held up the oilskin packet. "But I'm betting this does." And with that, Rowan lifted her blacksmith's hammer, its polished head gleaming in the morning sun. "I hope you brought a warrant, Sheriff," she said, her voice a low growl. The sheriff hesitated. His gaze flickered from the hammer to the axe to the packet in Cal's hand. He was a man caught in the middle, and he knew it. A slow, weary grin spread across his face. "Oh, Rowan," he said, shaking his head. "I always did admire your fire." Then, without another word, he turned his horse and rode away, kicking up a cloud of dust behind him. Cal turned to Rowan, his heart still pounding. "That was a bluff." "Yes," she said, watching the sheriff disappear down the trail. "But he'll be back, and the next time he won't be alone, and he won't be smiling." Cal looked at the small, defiant cabin they had started to rebuild. He looked at the simple fence and the lonely grave marked by the splintered cross. "Then we make our case to the whole town before he gets the chance." Rowan nodded. She looked at him then, a long, searching look that seemed to peel back every layer of his soul. "I didn't ask for you to come into my life, Cal Whitaker," she said softly. "I know," he replied, "but I'm glad I did." He didn't answer with more words. He just walked over to where their meager supplies were packed and offered her the water skin. They would ride back into the lion's den together. Dust in their teeth, the law at their heels, and a desperate gamble as their only shield. But for the first time in a very long time, neither one of them felt truly alone. The road back into Bright Marrow wasn't just a dirt path anymore. It was a gauntlet. Every rock and twisted tree seemed to hide an enemy. Every gust of wind sounded like a whispered threat. Cal and Rowan rode in silence, their eyes constantly scanning the ridges around them. The parchment in Cal's coat pocket felt like it weighed 100 pounds. It was either their salvation or their death warrant. What they were about to do, walk into the heart of Brack's town, stand before his judge, and challenge his power with a forgotten piece of paper. It wasn't just bold. It was a special kind of crazy. As they reached the edge of town, a place they'd named Bitterwind Pass, they slowed their pace. The town lay before them, quiet and menacing. "Is there anyone in this whole town you trust?" Cal asked, his voice low. Rowan was silent for a long moment. "One," she finally said. "Who?" She pointed with her chin toward a small, whitewashed building with peeling red shutters at the far end of the main street. It looked more respectable than the saloon, but not quite as pious as the church. "Miss Tilly's boarding house. Tilly used to mend my sister's school dresses for free. She has no love for Virgil Brack, and she hates a liar more than she hates sin." It was a long shot, but it was the only one they had. They guided their borrowed horse through the back alleys, avoiding the main street, and tied it to a hitching post behind the boarding house. Rowan knocked twice, a specific rhythmic pattern. The door creaked open a few inches, and a single suspicious blue eye peered out. "Rowan Hale," a woman's voice rasped. I heard they sold you, figured you were dead or gone. Barely, Rowan replied. Tilly's eye shifted to Cal, taking in his bruised face and tattered clothes. And who's this scarecrow? My husband, Rowan said, the words sounding a little less strange this time. Tilly's eyebrows shot up so high they disappeared into her wrinkled forehead. Have you gone completely mad, child? No, Rowan said. Just completely out of time. The door swung open wide. Then get yourselves inside before one of Brack's vultures sees you. The inside of the boarding house was clean and smelled of cinnamon and wood smoke. It was a small island of civilization in a sea of corruption. Cal laid the map and the provisional deed out on a small wooden table. Tilly squinted at the documents through a pair of spectacles perched on the end of her nose. I remember your daddy, she said to Cal, her voice softening. A quiet man. Never said 2 words if one would do. But he knew this land. He knew where the rivers ran before God himself decided to put them there. Her finger traced the lines of the old map. This deed, she said, tapping the parchment, was filed a full 5 years before Brack ever bought his first acre here. She looked up at them, her blue eyes sharp. Then you have a case, a strong one, assuming Judge Trolley doesn't just have you thrown out for contempt of breathing. We need a witness, Rowan said. Someone the judge can't ignore. Tilly stood up, her back straight and her chin held high. Then I will walk you over to that courthouse myself. Let's see Virgil Brack try to call me a liar. When the 3 of them stepped outside, the town square was no longer quiet. It was buzzing like a disturbed hornet's nest. Miners, traders, ranch hands, they all stood in small groups, whispering and staring. And there, standing on the steps of the whitewashed courthouse like he owned the place, which, in a way, he did, was Virgil Brack. He was clean-shaven, his boots polished to a mirror shine, and he was surrounded by at least 6 of his hired guns, all of them with their hands resting casually on their belts. Well, well, Brack called out, his voice carrying across the square. He smiled, but it was the cold, thin smile of a hangman. If it isn't the giant widow and her charity case. Cal didn't break his stride. Rowan walked beside him, her steps slow and deliberate. Tilly marched alongside them like a seasoned general, leading her troops into battle. Inside, the courtroom was packed. It smelled of sweat, fear, and cheap tobacco. Judge Trolley, a man whose face was a roadmap of broken veins, looked up from the glass of whiskey he was nursing. Rowan Hale, he drawled, his voice thick and slurred. I thought I signed the papers for your auction myself. You signed a lie, Your Honor, Rowan said, her voice clear and strong as she stepped forward. This man bought my freedom, and we have filed a joint land claim that supersedes any of yours. The judge blinked, his alcohol-fogged brain struggling to catch up. Cal stepped up to the bench and laid the deed and the map on the stained wood. Trolley stared at them, his eyes widening slightly, as he recognized the official federal seal. Just then, Brack barged into the courtroom, his men flanking him. That claim is expired. It's worthless. It's a provisional federal survey claim, Tilly cut in, her voice sharp as a needle. Filed before the territorial mapping was complete. There is no statute of expiration on such a claim until official statehood is granted. The judge knew it was true. Everyone did. It was a loophole, but it was a legal one. Cal met Brack's furious glare. You want to argue the law, Brack, or you want to settle this outside? Brack didn't flinch. He took a step closer, his voice a low, venomous hiss. You're a dead man the second you step out that door. Judge Trolley coughed, looking uncomfortable. He was a corrupt man, but he wasn't a stupid one. He could see the tide turning. Let me be perfectly clear, he said, trying to regain control. This marriage looks like a desperate stunt. It's the only reason she's standing here breathing, Cal shot back. She didn't lure me. I saw an injustice, and I stood against it. Is that so hard to believe? It makes you both fools, the judge muttered. But then he tapped the deed with a crooked finger. However, if this map is real and this claim is valid, we have ourselves a significant legal entanglement. He looked from Brack's furious face to Cal's determined one. He was trapped. He slammed his gavel down, the sound cracking through the tense silence. I will issue a formal hearing. 3 days from now, if no counter-proof is presented by Mr. Brack, the federal deed stands, and this court will recognize the marriage. Brack snarled, his face contorted with rage. Over my dead body! Judge Trolley looked at him, a flicker of defiance in his bloodshot eyes. That can be arranged, Virgil. Suddenly, the world outside the courthouse exploded. The sharp crack of gunfire ripped through the air, followed by a woman's scream. Tilly, reacting with instincts honed by years of living on the frontier, shoved Rowan to the floor just as a second shot shattered the window of the courthouse, spraying glass across the room. Cal drew the old worn revolver he'd taken from one of Brack's men, but the chaos was already over as quickly as it had begun. Brack's men in the square had started shooting at a figure in a nearby alley, but what they didn't know was that they had missed their intended target, and they had been seen. Sheriff Croft stepped out into the open, his rifle leveled not at the figure in the alley, but aimed directly at Virgil Brack's chest. "Drop it, Virgil," the sheriff commanded, his voice deadly calm. Brack froze, his hand still on the pistol he had started to draw. "Sheriff, you just fired on a United States courthouse. That's a federal offense." "And you just tried to have 2 people assassinated in broad daylight," the sheriff replied, his finger tightening on the trigger. "I ought to bury you under this courthouse." Slowly, his eyes burning with a hatred so intense it was almost tangible, Brack lowered his weapon. He looked past the sheriff, his gaze locking onto Cal. "This isn't over, Drifter." "No," Cal said, helping Rowan to her feet. "It's just getting started." Rowan stood, brushing the dust and glass from her dress. She looked at Cal, at the fierce determination in his eyes. "You could have run," she said. "So could you," he replied. Tilly shook her head, a look of weary amazement on her face. "You two," she said, "are either the most blessed pair I've ever met, or the most cursed." Back at Tilly's boarding house that night, sleep was an impossibility. The events of the day played over and over in Cal's mind. He sat in a chair by the small window, watching the moonlit street, the old revolver resting in his lap. Rowan sat on the edge of the bed, her back to him, a still and silent silhouette in the dim light of an oil lamp. The silence stretched for hours. Finally, she spoke, her voice so quiet he had to strain to hear it. "I never told you what really happened to my husband, George." Cal sat up, his heart suddenly heavy. "You don't have to." "Yes," she said, turning her head slightly. "I do." She took a deep, shuddering breath. "Brack didn't just want the ranch. He wanted to break me. His men, they came to the house weeks before the auction. They said they were there to appraise the land. George, he wasn't a fighter. He was a kind, gentle man. He got scared. He tried to fight them off with nothing but an old pitchfork." She paused, the memory choking her. "They just laughed at him." She turned away again, her shoulders shaking. "The spot where you saw the grave, that's where I buried him. But I had to bury the blood-soaked dirt from the porch right there beside him." Cal stood up and walked over to her. He didn't know what to say. There were no words for that kind of horror. He just stood there, a silent presence in the room. Rowan didn't look at him, but she asked the question that had been hanging between them since the moment she claimed him. "Why did you really do it, Cal? Why spend your last coin on me?" He didn't answer right away. He looked out the window at the sleeping, corrupt town of Bright Marrow. He thought about his own past, about the brother he couldn't save, about the years he'd spent feeling like a ghost. Finally, he spoke, his voice soft and raw, with a truth he'd never admitted to anyone, not even himself. "Because for a second, when I looked at you up on that auction block, surrounded by vultures, I saw myself. and I needed to believe that someone like me was still worth saving. She turned then and looked at him, her face fully illuminated by the lamplight. For the first time, there was no armor, no iron wall, and Rowan Hale, the giant widow of Winder's Ridge, began to cry. Not tears of weakness or despair. They were tears of a dam breaking, of a woman who had been fighting alone for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to have someone stand not in front of her, not behind her, but right there beside her. 3 days. That was all the time the judge had given them. 3 days felt like a lifetime, and no time at all. The dusty streets of Bitter Wind swelled with a nervous energy, like the air before a lightning strike. But this storm wasn't in the clouds. It was on the ground, and it wore spurs and carried guns. Word of the hearing had spread like wildfire. The widow was back. The drifter who'd bought her was claiming her land with a federal deed. And everyone knew Virgil Brack was not a man who took losing well. People lined the boardwalks, leaning from second-story balconies. Children whispered in hushed tones. Women clutched their shawls a little tighter. Even the saloon, usually a raucous den of noise and vice, had shut its doors. The entire town was holding its breath. Inside the courthouse, the air was as thick as molasses. The room was packed, shoulder to shoulder. You could smell the sweat and the fear. The creak of a man's leather boots on the floorboards sounded as loud as a thunderclap. Cal stood near the front, Rowan a tall, immovable presence by his side. She wore a simple, clean dress, but her eyes were made of steel. Tilly stood right behind them, a silent, unshakable pillar of support. Judge Trolley, looking more sober than Cal had ever seen him, banged his gavel. This court is now in session. We are here today to determine the validity of the provisional land claim on Winder's Ridge, as filed by Mr. Calvin Ward and his lawfully wedded wife, Mrs. Rowan Hale Ward, and to assess its legality in the context of prior holdings by one Mr. Virgil Brack. Brack rose slowly from his chair, moving with the fluid, deadly grace of a cobra uncoiling. Your Honor, he began, his voice smooth as silk, I have witnesses. I have documents. I own every hill and every drop of water from Bitter Wind to the Caldwell Fork. This is nothing more than a desperate charade. Judge Trolley grunted. You also have a habit of bleeding this town dry, Virgil. Let's hear their case. Cal stepped forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. We have a deed, Your Honor, filed under the Federal Surveyors Act of '77. My father, a federal agent, marked that land and its resources before Mr. Brack ever bought his first fence post in this territory. He carefully unrolled the parchment on the judge's bench. Rowan laid the worn, hand-drawn map beside it. Brack's lawyer, a slick man with sour breath and beady eyes, pounced. That land was abandoned. The claim is null. The Hale woman forfeited any and all rights when she failed to properly register her husband's death within the mandated 30 days. Before Cal could respond, Rowan's voice cut through the room like a blade. I never forfeited anything. I was too busy burying my husband while Mr. Brack's men stood on my porch and laughed. Then they came for my land. Then they came for me. The room went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Even Brack's oily lawyer looked momentarily rattled. This wasn't about property anymore. This was about something far uglier. Judge Trolley leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Brack. Is that true, Virgil? Brack didn't answer. He just stared at Rowan, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. It was the look of a man whose power had been challenged, and he didn't know how to handle it. I invoke my right to contest the validity of these documents, he finally snarled. You'll have your say, the judge muttered, his patience clearly wearing thin. But this court has had its fill of your intimidation tactics. Brack smirked. Then by all means, let's get on with it. The judge called Sheriff Croft to the stand. Sheriff, you've seen this federal survey. You've compared it to the county records. What are your findings? The sheriff stood tall, his hand resting on the Bible. He looked at Brack. He looked at Rowan and Cal. He took a deep breath. It checks out, Your Honor. The map is authentic. The provisional claim is legally binding. According to federal law, the land known as Winder's Ridge belongs to Calvin Ward and his wife. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. It was over. They had won. There was a heavy, final pause. The judge lifted his gavel, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. In light of this evidence, this court recognizes. The deafening cock of a pistol hammer cut him off. Everyone froze. Virgil Brack was on his feet, a silver-plated revolver in his hand, aimed directly at the judge. "No," he hissed, his voice trembling with a terrifying rage. "This court recognizes nothing. This town belongs to me." Screams erupted. People scrambled for cover. In that split second of chaos, Rowan acted. She shoved Cal hard, pushing him behind her just as Brack's gun went off. The shot slammed into Cal's shoulder, spinning him around. He hit the floor with a grunt, a searing pain exploding through his arm. But before Brack could aim for a second killing shot, Rowan charged. She didn't scream. She didn't hesitate. She moved like an avenging angel, a force of nature. She rammed into Virgil Brack like a falling redwood tree. They crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs, Brack's pistol skidding across the wooden planks. The sheriff lunged for the gun. Tilly screamed. The courtroom dissolved into pure, unadulterated chaos. Rowan was on top of Brack, her fists flying. All the years of fear, of humiliation, of grief, it all came pouring out in a torrent of pure, righteous fury. Brack swung wildly, his fist connecting with her jaw, but she barely seemed to feel it. She staggered for a second, then landed a blow that cracked his lip and sent a spray of blood across the floor. The sheriff and his deputies finally managed to pull her off him. They dragged a bleeding, cursing Virgil Brack out of the courthouse, his reign of terror finally at an end. Silence fell, thick and heavy, broken only by the sound of Cal groaning on the floor. He tried to get up, but the pain in his shoulder was a white-hot fire. Blood was soaking through his shirt. "Stay down," Rowan said, her voice shaking as she fell to her knees beside him. He managed a weak, pained laugh. You just tackled a man twice your size." She smiled then, a real, genuine smile that lit up her whole face. "Well," she said, gently touching his uninjured cheek, "you did buy a woman twice your weight. Seems to me fair is fair." He reached up, his hand trembling, and touched her face. He winced as a fresh wave of pain shot through him. "I always said, if I ever got married, I wanted a wife who could carry me home." She took his hand, her grip strong and sure. "You will," she promised. Later that evening, as the sun set over Bitter Wind, casting long shadows across the valley, they sat on the porch of their reclaimed ranch. The house was still crumbling in places, the barn was still half-roofed, but it was theirs. Every splintered board, every loose stone, it was all theirs. Rowan carefully finished stitching the bandage on Cal's shoulder. "You could have died today," she said softly. "I know." She paused, her hands still. "Was it worth it?" Cal didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, at the quiet strength in her face, the fierce loyalty in her eyes. "You never asked me what I did before all this. What my trade was." She raised an eyebrow. "What?" He nodded toward the vast, beautiful, and broken land that stretched out before them. "I was a builder." She looked out across their land, at the endless possibilities stretching to the horizon. "Then build us a life, Cal Whitaker." He smiled, a slow, easy smile that reached his eyes. "I already started," he said, "the moment you claimed me." The wind stirred the tall prairie grass, whispering secrets only the land knew. A hawk cried out as it soared high overhead. And for the first time in more years than she could count, Rowan Hale, once a widow, once a prisoner of grief and injustice, felt something she thought she had buried forever: hope. And if that ending gripped your heart like it did mine, don't just scroll on by. Do me a favor and hit that big red subscribe button and make sure you turn on the notification bell because you are not going to want to miss the next powerful story we have lined up. It might just change the way you see love, loyalty, or life itself. And before you go, drop a comment down below and tell us where in the world you're watching from. We see you out there, from Wyoming to Nairobi, from Texas to Toronto, and we'd love to give you a shout out in the next one. Stick around. The next story is going to be even bigger.